to GEC Important Talks. This is a podcast series presented by Global Education Connection, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing children who are affected by conflict or natural disasters with resources like educational materials and art supplies. As part of this podcast, we want to talk about important topics related to children, their human rights, and their education. Of course, none of us are an expert on these topics. We speak only to our knowledge, our personal experiences, and our perspectives. But there are many credible online sources for further information. Today we have myself, Kathryn and
Carter Beck
as your hosts. We also have a special guest on today,
Ellie Armstrong.
And today we're going to be talking about the Kids Online Safety Act, and I think from that we're also going to branch off into kids' use of social media in general.
Ellie, thank you for being on today. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background with social media? Because I think in this conversation you're going to be one of our material experts on social media usage.
Yeah, absolutely. So hello, everybody. My name is Ellie Armstrong. As he said, I'm a sophomore at Vanderbilt University currently studying political science and public policy. I've worked quite a bit in the social media space, working for a variety of different social media managers or working on marketing teams for particular nonprofits and stuff like that. And I've recently come on as GEC's social media intern, particularly for their Instagram. So I've worked a lot in this space, and I feel like, especially as it becomes more and more influential, especially within youth lives, it's really important to consider what policy interventions we take as a society. So I think this is going to be a super fun conversation, and I really appreciate being on here with y'all.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for being on, and I think this will be a good conversation.
Yeah, I think it's going to be great. It's going to be a great conversation. So first up, I feel like we should talk a little bit about what the Kids Online Safety Act actually is. So for those of you who don't know, this is a bill that has been put forth in the Senate. This is actually the third time it's been put forth. The first two times failed. But essentially, it's a bill that will require social media platforms to provide minors with options to protect their information, disable addictive product features, and opt out of algorithmic recommendations. It also goes into requirements on things that should be limited for minors to see. The bill also works to limit minors' access to posts on social media about things like suicide, drug use, or sexual exploitation. So this is a bipartisan bill. Both Democrats and Republicans have put it forward and signed on as co-sponsors. So this isn't just one political party putting this forward. It's kind of not entirely universal because not all the senators are on board yet, and it also there isn't something similar to it in the House just yet. But it has been put forward by both political parties and is something that both sides are working to address, especially given that President Biden has explicitly stated that kids' online safety is something that he considers very important to him.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that kids' online safety is very much a bipartisan issue. I don't think anyone can say that it's not an issue. So at that point, it's only that our two-party system, both Republicans and Democrats, want to be able to help address in the most efficient and the safest way for minors. So at that, it's really just about policy and implementation. That's really come to question at this point for KOSA, at least.
Absolutely. So I feel like we should talk briefly about the concerns that this bill raises because, like I said, this has been put forward twice before and has failed both times. Something that is a concern for activists and human rights organizations, including the ACLU. The ACLU has stated multiple times that they are against this bill. Is concerned that it would violate things like the First Amendment, or it would work to censor kids' access to things like LGBTQ plus resources or mental health resources. So what do you both think about that?
Kathryn, I think you might be referring to an article published on CNBC from May 2nd. I have it up right now, written by Lauren Feiner. I see that the ACLU, I'm going to quote from the article right now, the ACLU remains strongly opposed to KOSA because it would ironically expose the very children it seeks to protect to increased harm and increased surveillance. And that's according to the ACLU Senior Policy Counsel, Cody Vensky. So I think that might be one of the articles that you were referring to, and I just think that's very interesting that we have that kind of disagreement from a bipartisan bill that came across as almost being voted through unanimously.
Yeah, definitely.
Ellie, what are your thoughts on it?
Honestly, I don't know super hardcore about public reactions to the bill specifically and especially in terms of concerns as to constitutional infringements and things such as that. I do think it's important to think about, regardless of what type of media we're talking about, whether that be social media or other forms of media like television or newspapers or whatever else. When you're thinking about, content and stuff, I think saying, oh, everything needs to be absolutely free reign all the time or something like that. It's just the fact is there's content that exists on these platforms that children shouldn't be interacting with. And I mean, we already have plenty of limitations in place, even if they don't work the best, are you 18? And so I think elaborating on those is something, it already exists. And so I don't think there's going to be any more infringement than is already occurring, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who spent 2 minutes on TikTok or Facebook knows how you have to censor things in order for it to not get removed from the platforms. But I think the concern is mostly in that this bill gives, from my knowledge of it, it would give power to state attorney generals on what they think should be limited for children to see. So a concern with that is in more conservative states that the attorney generals would limit, like I said, children's access to things like LGBTQ plus resources. Another facet of this bill is that it would also give more access to a child's social media to their parents, so that they would be able to control more of stuff like that. But in that case, I think it also presents a danger for, like I was saying, LGBTQ plus minors who might not feel comfortable coming out to their parents, who might not be safe to come out to their parents, who now have to be very careful with what they're saying to their friends who may be the only people they can talk to about this, or what they're looking up online to understand that, hey, being gay is okay, even if they don't necessarily live in a household where that's true for them. And again, it's not just for LGBTQ plus kids. There are plenty of children whose home lives are abusive, who may use the internet as a way to speak to their friends, to reach out to domestic violence resource centers, who may then lose that accessibility because their parents have more access to their social media.
Yeah, I 100% agree with what you're saying, and I think that kind of raises an interesting thing, and something that I think I have an issue with the bill is that I think it's approaching this issue kind of from the wrong lens, because it's saying, oh, here's all this safe stuff or unsafe stuff that exists on social media that we need to protect kids from it, so we're just gonna not let the minors see it, but it's still going to exist there. And so, yeah, I think it kind of allows a lot more policing for things that aren't necessarily bad, like LGBTQ content and stuff like that. I definitely agree that it's a lot more correctable than it would be to, let's introduce a bill that cracks down on things for instance, Twitter specifically has a huge issue with big communities that promote self-harm and eating disorders really, really heavily. And it's very, very poorly moderated and stuff like that. It's so common and it's so intense. And, a bill like this isn't going to do anything about that, but it is nonetheless probably going to reach minors anyway, and it's reaching a lot of other people too that aren't minors but still may be at a younger age in which they're seeing this and being exposed to material that they shouldn't be, or that anybody really should be. So yeah, I think it just kind of that raises the idea that, are we addressing this in the correct way?
But on the nature of eating disorders and self-harm, things like that. Obviously, content that is advocating for things like that is dangerous and should be removed, but I don't necessarily think we should limit that kind of discussion online, especially when talking like people are sharing experiences. That's a great way to understand that you're not alone, that just because you feel this way, it doesn't mean that other people don't too. Not saying it's good, obviously, but that it can necessarily help build a sense of community and a sense of understanding, and from that it could be a great way to share resources on how to combat eating disorders or self-harm or depression, or a great way to, advocate for more mental health resources by sharing those stories, by sharing those experiences. So I think you also have to walk the very fine line of what is promoting these topics and then what is just speaking to something that is very real and very human that needs to be addressed.
Also, looking at like the scope for how many kids this does impact, I pulled some information from Pew Research, published August 10th, 2022. For the 2022 survey, 95% of teens reported the use of YouTube, followed with 67% for TikTok, 62% for Instagram, 59% for Snapchat. So with YouTube, that's Google, TikTok, Instagram, that's going to be Meta. The majority of teens in the United States are using these social media platforms. So the reach that these social media companies have on and influence for teens, it's affecting millions of teenagers at this point. So that kind of explains the scope for what this bill has the impact, has, I guess, the scope of the impact for this bill.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been on social media since like before I can remember at this point. Like, especially like growing up in such a small town that I did, that was like one of the few ways that I could communicate with other people, or share things about my life. So it, like, of course it comes with its dangers, but I also feel like the bill is kind of ignoring some of the plus sides that people get out of social media.
Kathryn, last week we talked about like one of the benefits was being able to communicate with our elected representatives. Their influence and their communication on social media is a fantastic way for us to be able to see what they're doing, what their thoughts are, and for also us to be able to reach out to them. So that's one of the really big benefits of social media, and so that's something that should be protected, is our ability to be able to speak freely with our elected officials. But also we have to realize that there are dangers on social media where people are putting content that is not appropriate for kids. And so, Ellie, that speaks to what you said, where this bill might not really be addressing the root cause. It's more of just blindfolding people that shouldn't be seeing the content that's on there, rather than addressing how the content is on these platforms to begin with.
Yeah, it's going after the autonomy to seek out that information rather than addressing the information existing in and of itself. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like putting a Band-Aid over a bullet wound. It's not actually addressing the problem. It's just trying to say, we're trying to protect kids because we know this is an issue, but we're not actually doing it in, I think, the substantive way that it needs to be done. And another issue that comes with this is, of course, how do you verify that these people are actually minors or actually adults? I know, not myself, obviously, because I would never out myself for doing this on a podcast, but there are plenty of ways to lie about your age on the internet. It is very easy for minors to get into adult-only spaces. So how do you prevent them from doing that? Do we all now have to suddenly give, like, a photocopy of our ID or our birth certificate to social media companies? Because then I think that's a huge violation of privacy. And, like, given how much social media companies are already taking our data and selling it to other, companies or other platforms, I think that presents a like incredible danger to privacy as we know it, especially online.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that is like by far like the weakest point of the bill. Is like, I think I wrote down on section 9, and if this is if that's the incorrect section, let me know. But they talk about, how are we going to verify this? And basically they say, a handful of these governmental organizations are essentially going to study it. They it isn't something that they've looked into, it's something that they're going to look into. And so but the verification part, identifying who is or is not a minor, is the very foundation of what this bill is trying to do. And I 100% agree, Kathryn, that they don't quite have this complexity figured out at all. And I do appreciate the discussion and the existence of the bill, but yes, it's very clearly not quite thought out all the way and not quite solidified. Yeah.
Well, if you do look at a registration process where you might have to put in information based off of a driver's license or an ID, that might pose a separate issue where people who are illegal immigrants might not have access to social media, where, I don't see any reason why they shouldn't have access. And that really limits their ability and their access to, you could say, First Amendment rights with social media. And so being able to, I can see an instance where if you have a particular state where the Attorney General wants to potentially maybe nefariously use the data and prosecute people that because their data is registered with these social media companies. Yeah, I think that like you said, Kathryn, presents a very serious danger to people in fear of the attorney generals.
Definitely. So not only illegal immigrants who might not have access to documents, but what about people who have been human trafficked? What about people who have experienced some form of identity abuse? Because that's a thing. People who aren't able to access their documents because their parents either didn't file it or don't give them access to it. How are they then going to be able to access the internet? So I think it presents such a huge issue that I don't think a lot of people are necessarily talking about in regards to that, because it goes beyond just me showing them my ID to be able to access this, but plenty of people who should be able to access it, but who would no longer be able to because they don't have access to these documents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I have to agree with the ACLU position on this, where I think I can easily see a point where this bill does the exact opposite of what it's intending to do in the protection of minors. And I'm sure that wasn't the original intent of the bipartisan bill, but it's just the ambiguity of the bill presents these cases it presents these cases from becoming a reality, where the unintended consequences can become reality.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think the senators are necessarily trying to be nefarious with this. I don't think they're trying to... I think they're trying to address an issue. I don't think they've gone about it in the right way or are necessarily thinking about it in the way that should be done.
Also, it's strange that it got basically a full unanimous approval. So the senators just not fully understanding the bill, or maybe just hadn't sought out enough analysis from different points of view, where they could have seen where maybe this bill wasn't written properly. It seems really strange to me that it was unanimous.
I think something that may kind of contribute to such widespread approval of the bill would be just I think at this point in our society, it's very obvious that there's an issue with unsafe content being accessible to minors. And so I feel it is indeed a nonpartisan issue that most people would agree is something to acknowledge. And I think it's just, okay, here's a solution that exists. And a lot of these people that are in these positions of power don't have the perspective of growing up using social media. They aren't growing up using it as kind of like we said earlier, it's a big mode of communication with friends, of support online, of this or that. They just haven't relied on it in the same way that kids today do. And so I think they just don't see a lot of these issues that we can see a lot easier, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
I think that kind of also speaks to the average age of a U.S. senator is 64. These aren't people who necessarily use social media the way that Gen Z and millennials do, who haven't, like you were saying, experienced it the way we do. Like, they all have a social media office. It's run by their marketing team or like their social media management team. They're not the ones actually using social media itself. So I think it also comes down to like a kind of ignorance on their part, because they don't know the realities of social media. They just see whatever the media presents it as or whatever the other senators around them are saying it is. So I think it also speaks to the generational divides as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there was only one part within the actual bill itself that I think they really actually did kind of see it a little bit more objectively, or at least however it was written. In section 12, it talks about a kids online safety council being established sometime after the bill is assumedly passed. And they mentioned oh, it's created by the Secretary of Commerce, but they were saying it's your typical experts, doctors are in it, but they also mentioned we want representatives from every single large social media site. We want parents, we want youth, all to be included onto this council, and the council is specifically for identifying risks to minors online and creating measures to stop those. But yeah, that was the only part of the bill that I was like, wow, they're really genuinely considering, sources that, I feel like this will be impacted by the bill most significantly.
That is a good addition to the bill. So hopefully there can be another revision of KOSA where maybe they incorporate that into the revision. But I think at the point where the bill relies on the enforcement to be at the discretion of different state attorney generals, I think that's very troublesome, because state attorney generals can change every couple of years with different administrations, and so at that point you could be flip-flopping between attorney generals that have a priority on one aspect compared to another, and so that itself also creates ambiguity and confusion in how and when the bill is going to be enforced.
Plus, then you have 50 different people saying how they want this bill to be applied within their state. And how does that work if a minor were to leave their state and then go to another state for vacation or something? Would they suddenly have so much different access to the internet because they're in a whole totally different place? And how would that work if these attorney generals are able to censor some things? Would they then start to try to extend that power to silencing political opponents as they're discussing things that aren't appropriate for children? Where do you draw the line between what is actually okay for these attorney generals to censor and what isn't?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't like that gray area that exists, because that leaving that kind of enforcement power open to interpretation creates opportunities for abuse, and that is something that people need to be aware of and actively be voicing their opinions, hopefully against that.
Yeah, and I definitely think, as we've seen in various states, the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, as more censorship is being done in schools, I think the internet is being used more as a tool for kids to be able to access information about things that they would have previously had access to information to in schools. Because if they're going to censor things about mental health or LGBTQ plus issues, when does that then expand into things I don't know, periods? Our teen girls not going to be able to access information about their own reproductive health online? Or sex education. There are plenty of states who rely on an abstinence-only policy that isn't feasibly realistic for teenagers. I hate to break it to you, it's not realistic. So the internet is, again, maybe not the most accurate source of information for stuff like that, but it is a source of information that they can use. So I think it then spreads into other dangers as well that people aren't just quite realizing, because if they can censor one thing, who's to say that they're not going to just say that they can't censor another?
Yeah, because it leaves it open to the interpretation of the attorney generals and how and what they want to enforce.
Yeah.
Wow. So hopefully hopefully that bill doesn't go through because so Ellie, you said that it's a step in the right direction and it addresses a concern that we all have, but I think that the senators, like Kathryn said, need to incorporate some of the voices and the people that more actively use these social media platforms, so that way they fully understand the implications of what could be.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I 100% agree with you. And I think when they put in, that section 12 that, oh, hey, we're going to include, all of these relevant people in this Kids Online Safety Council, it's almost like asking, this is kind of, I guess, an intense way to say it, but asking for forgiveness, not permission. Because they're saying, okay, we're going to outline the rules, and then later we're going to have these voices come in, instead of being like, hey, let's have these people come in preemptively before we put down these hardcore foundations. So yeah, I think it's just I agree with what Kathryn said earlier. It's just ignorance. They're not really seeing it for what it is, and they're saying, because obviously they do see these voices to some degree, but they're not considering the fact that these voices need to come in a lot earlier in the conversation.
But also, I also do understand the sense of urgency where something needs to be done basically yesterday. Like something should have been done years ago to address the abuses of what has been able to be published on these social media platforms. Like we've seen instances. Wasn't there was a mass shooting that occurred, I think, in New Zealand a couple years ago, where didn't the shooter live stream their the shooting on one of the social media platforms? But issues like that where you have harm that is clearly being published on these social media platforms, that should not in any way have ever been able to occur. And at that point, social media companies need to be held responsible for that. Just like if you get into an accident while you're driving a vehicle and it was because of a mechanical failure, that is at the point where the automaker needs to be held reliable, because that was their responsibility to ensure that the vehicle was safe to be able to be driven. So I think at the same point, social media companies need to be held liable for the content that is published on their end. And I know that's a big responsibility and that's a big ask, but at the point where they reach 95% of teens, at the point where they reach 67% for TikTok, if they have that level of reach, they need to also be accountable for that level of influence.
Yeah, I think that's a super, super great metaphor, to call it by. Because I think, and logistically, I think it would just be so much easier to mandate, hey, let a much stricter, not necessarily algorithm, but a much stricter process of reporting bad content, so that the content doesn't exist again, instead of just censoring it for kids. But yeah, I 100% agree.
I think, again, just another one of the issues is government overreach. If they're saying what you can and can't post, is that a violation of the First Amendment? Are they taking away your right to free speech? So I think even if this gets passed by the Senate, it could actually see legal challenges based on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, it's at the point where it's only in the Senate. It still has to go through the House, then it has to be approved by the Senate again, then it has to be, with our legal process, then it has to be approved by the president, and then through the Supreme Court again. So it's got several hurdles to go, and hopefully more people will be able to raise their concerns regarding some of the safeties and protections that the bill doesn't protect. So hopefully in the next couple of steps there'll be some meaningful changes. But like I said, I hope it happens soon, because there are active harms that are going on.
And I don't think anyone's negating the fact that social media has its vices and virtues, especially towards children. I just again I don't think this bill is the right way to go about it.
Yeah, I agree. So like I said, I agree with the statement from the ACLU where I don't agree with it because of the unintended consequences that it presents.
Yeah.
So. Awesome. Ellie, was there anything else from your research that you saw regarding KOSA that you wanted to bring up?
I'm trying to think. I'm going through my notes super quick. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it we kind of already went over during this. I think it's just like, again, the idea is there. This is something we need to address, but going about it and addressing all the complexities and nuances that exist is something this bill obviously didn't really do. And it skips over a lot of like very basic foundational things you would think would be necessitated in a bill like this. Like, even, there was a part of the bill that talked about, we want parents to be notified if their child, signs up for this or goes through X, Y, or Z process. And the process for which that parental notification would occur was just quote unquote reasonable steps for like parental confirmation. Like it's just very, very key things just completely glossed over.
Yeah.
It just kind of again inherently indicate that there's disconnect in terms of, thinking about social media versus how it actually works in practice.
Yeah. Keith, what was the term? Reasonable steps.
Reasonable steps.
Yeah, reasonable steps is not an adequate way to inform the guardian or parent, whoever is responsible for the minor at that point. So it's just
if I used the phrase reasonable steps in Model UN, they would have no. Absolutely not. They would have been, go back and rewrite this right now. What do you mean by reasonable steps?
Yeah, or if you use that in a conversation where like, yeah, I will take reasonable steps to address this. Like, come on, I need more concrete information rather than just my subjective opinion as to what is a reasonable step.
Yeah, exactly. It leaves it up for so much interpretation, which I'm not gonna lie is probably intentional on their part. Like they don't want to get in and micromanage it, so they're trying to leave it up to either the states or social media companies. But then again, that presents such a big danger for what they will interpret these reasonable steps as. But I also think another danger that comes with this is that if social media companies are looking at all of these lists of things that they now have to do to quote-unquote protect minors online, what's to stop them from just banning minors from using their platforms and then completely stripping them away of the ability to use social media?
Well, I think that the sheer number of users is what's gonna deter them from making that drastic step. I mean, like I said, 95% of kids use YouTube. 67% use TikTok. So that's a very large number. I mean, we're talking millions. And so that's millions of users where you don't want to ban millions of users from your platforms, because I mean, from a business point of view, I can see where that would really hurt their business, like core business for like the advertisers wouldn't be able to advertise to that demographic, and so that's less revenue for the company.
But I could see them doing it if it became a big enough of a legal liability. Or if it costs more money to implement these changes and like maintain those changes than just stopping minors from using the platforms altogether, or like raising the age from like 13 to 16, so like to even again limit the number of people that they have to manage this for.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I can see like both of y'all's like the realities of what both of y'all are saying. Like from my perspective, I think like just like if I were to like hypothetically assume like in a world where this would happen, I feel like kind of both of those would be the case, because it's true that these are like giant like majorities of their target demographic. I don't think they would want to lose those, but at the same time, like if something is like explicitly and concretely illegal, they're going to do the best they can to avoid any issues with that. And so I think honestly, it like assumingly if it were to happen, I think it would just be kind of like barely enforced or enforced to a certain threshold, if that makes sense. Because I mean, like for example, their reporting system now, you can report nudity or self-harm or violence or anything like that, but how often does that reporting system actually work? It doesn't work very well, like at all. And I mean, they did mention like a reporting mechanism in the bill specifically, like, oh, if any harms happen, these platforms need to create a process, again, very vague, a process that exists to report these harms. But again, reporting now doesn't really work, so why would reporting work in the future? So I think it would kind of be a mixture of both of those, of we still want these kids to be here, but we still want to cater to, what the law says. So it would just kind of combine into nobody's really being helped here.
Yeah, and I
absolutely.
think especially with platforms like TikTok or YouTube or even like Instagram that get millions of posts every single day, it gets so much harder to filter and manage that stuff that like if like the platforms would be stuck between like a rock and a hard place. They have to pick the lesser of two evils. So like it's hard enough for them now to censor what is being posted on their platforms, which is why this content slips through the cracks, because like Ellie said, like they have mechanisms to report these things. They clearly don't want them on their platforms, but it's just there are so many people using them. There's so much getting posted every day that it's incredibly hard to actually filter and source it. That's why a lot of them rely on algorithms, which of course also have their vices and virtues, but it's a way to try and help manage that, even if it doesn't always work.
Yeah, and I agree, and I agree with what you're saying, that it's a huge responsibility because of the sheer volume of posts, but at the same time, like, because of the sheer volume of posts, that number also transfers to their margins, or transfers to their revenue, it transfers to their profit. So at the point where there's an increase, where these companies are making billions of dollars in profit, they need to, and they have the responsibility to also invest into better algorithms and better monitoring processes to safeguard their users. And I think that is their responsibility.
Absolutely.
Like I was trying to look up some information real quick, like YouTube. In 2022, YouTube generated $29.2 billion in revenue. So I mean, of course, that doesn't take into account the cost associated with running the platform, but also a cost associated with running the platform is going to be their content moderation and their policies, whether it's going to be actual like human moderators, or it's going to be the algorithms that are going to be filtering out what is harmful and not. So maybe there needs to be a larger investment into hiring more physical, like human moderators, because of the millions of posts that are seen. So at the point where you're making $29 billion in revenue, there needs to be also an increase in the amount invested for moderation.
That's really, really interesting. Specifically, I guess since you like brought that up, Carter, do you think so kind of like you said, as you get larger in your influence, you should also like have that ratio go up in terms of how much you spend on content moderation. In the bill, it talks about, there's a section specifically for like content platforms over a specific amount of users. So if you have, I forget what the exact amount was, it was a lot, but it was like, oh, if this platform is above this amount of users, there's some specific things you also have to do for us. So do you think that would be a functional or a plausible like route to go in terms of policy? Like particularly like, hey, once you reach a certain threshold, we want you to allocate more resources to your content moderation or hold higher standards. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and I think there's a direct correlation between the number of users and the reported profit and the reported revenue. So I mean that makes logical sense. The more users that are on your platform, if you have a solid business structure, then you're going to be generating more revenue. The more people that shop at your business, the more money you make. You build that into your margins. So I think that businesses that have, let's say, millions of users are going to be making millions of dollars in revenue, but there's a direct strong positive correlation with the amount of users and their revenue. So at that point, I think at the point where they have more users, significantly more users than, let's say, a smaller platform, they have responsibility because they have that amount of influence or that amount of reach. And so, and not saying that it's a bad thing. I mean, we've seen fantastic things with social media, Kathryn, like you said, with being able to access communities, be able to talk to people, to learn things where maybe you can't learn in school or you haven't been able to learn in school. I mean, I've used social media to learn things for school. So, I mean, it's just part of being a student and being wanting to be informed. And so with that, social media has great benefits, but the point where 95% of teens use YouTube, that's a lot of users. And these companies have the responsibility to protect them.
So I think before we wrap it up today, a really important final note that I wanted to make is that, of course, all of this is just our opinions, our perspectives on this issue, this bill, and of course, you all as listeners have your own individual opinions and power to make change. We are all, citizens that have the ability to contact our representatives, as we spoke about earlier in this episode and in last week's episode. Social media is a great way to contact your representatives, to speak to them about this bill, to express your opinions to them. You are their constituents. They will listen. You have the power to get them to listen to you, because you can vote them out if they don't. So whether you contact them by social media, by email, by phone call, by sending a letter, all of those are really great ways to express your opinions to their congressman and get them to maybe think about KOSA a little bit differently. So again, it's super important, and we encourage you all to do that. Now, if Carter wanted to speak to us briefly about our coloring book.
Yeah, of course. So if you like the content that we produce, if you like this podcast, if you like the mission that we have for our nonprofit, which is providing educational material and art supplies to kids around the world, like in Ukraine, like in Turkey, that have been affected by conflict or natural disaster, please go onto our Amazon page. You can purchase this coloring book. This is a great coloring book that we provide to these kids. It has great pictures, it has great facts, and it's just a great creative outlet for kids to be able to utilize to if they're in a particular situation, they can use this as a creative outlet to continue to learn and to draw, or here where it's a great learning resource for kids. So if you like what we do, please support us by purchasing this coloring book, either for yourself or for kids you may know. It's a great resource for them. Thank you for your support. We really appreciate it. It allows us to continue to produce this podcast and to continue our work. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Carter. All right, well, thank you all so much for listening today. This has been GEC Important Talks, hosted by the team at Global Education Connection. You can find us at our website, www.globaleducationconnection.org, where you can learn more about what we do, who we are, and how you can help support us. You can also find us on all of our social media platforms. So again, I just wanted to also thank Ellie for coming on today. It was really great having you on with us, and we hope to have you back in the future. Your input was very valued and so important, so thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ellie. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank y'all so much for having me. It was super, super fun. I love talking with y'all.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you all next week. Bye.